Interesting because my character kind of started happening unconsciously because I was suggesting it to myself that I was going to need this and it was going to be my friend.
Red Dawn wasn't just an action movie. It was Cold War fever dream made manifest. A film that turned high school students into guerrilla fighters and made Soviet invasion feel terrifyingly plausible. But behind the partisan warfare and patriotic sacrifice, nothing was subtle. John Milius turned teenage angst into military resistance. The violence was so extreme it created a new rating system, and the film's politics were so controversial that critics called it fascist propaganda disguised as entertainment. These are 15 weird facts about Red Dawn. 1. It created the PG-13 rating. Red Dawn's extreme violence, including multiple executions, civilian massacres, and graphic combat deaths, created a crisis for the MPAA rating system that had no category between PG and R. The film was too violent for PG, but lacked the sexual content or language that typically warranted R ratings, exposing gaps in classification standards. Parental complaints about children being exposed to war violence in a PG-rated film forced the industry to create PG-13 as intermediate warning category. Red Dawn became the first film released under the new rating, though several earlier films were retroactively reclassified. The rating's creation acknowledged that warfare violence required different standards than horror movie gore or adult themes. 2. John Milius based it on real guerrilla warfare tactics. Milius studied insurgent combat methods from Vietnam, Afghanistan, and Latin American conflicts to create authentic partisan resistance scenarios rather than Hollywood action fantasies. He consulted with military advisors who had fought against or alongside guerrilla forces to understand how civilians transition to combatants. The Wolverines' tactics, ambushes, supply raids, and hit-and-run attacks reflected genuine insurgent strategies documented in military studies and historical resistance movements. Milius wanted audiences to understand that successful resistance required discipline, sacrifice, and brutal pragmatism rather than simple patriotic enthusiasm. The film's combat sequences avoided heroic movie cliches in favor of showing how guerrilla warfare was desperate, dirty, and morally compromising for everyone involved. 3. The cast underwent actual military training. The young actors spent weeks in boot camp conditions, learning weapons handling, tactical movement, and survival skills from military instructors before filming began. Patrick Swayze, C. Thomas Howell, and others endured genuine physical hardship, including forced marches, survival exercises, and combat drills that prepared them for demanding action sequences. The training created authentic camaraderie and military bearing that made their transformation from teenagers to fighters more convincing than acting alone could achieve. Instructors pushed the cast beyond Hollywood comfort levels, creating genuine exhaustion and stress that enhanced performances during combat scenes. The preparation meant actors could handle weapons safely and move tactically without obvious incompetence that would undermine the film's realistic approach to partisan warfare. 4. Powers Boothe was the only experienced actor. Boothe, playing downed pilot Lieutenant Colonel Tanner, brought professional gravitas to a cast of relative newcomers who were still developing their screen presence and acting techniques. His character served as military mentor who transformed enthusiastic amateurs into disciplined guerrilla fighters through harsh lessons about warfare's reality. Boothe's performance grounded the film's more fantastical elements by providing authentic military perspective on the teenager situation and their slim chances for survival. The actor drew from his own research into Vietnam War experiences to portray a soldier who understood that heroism and sacrifice often looked nothing like Hollywood depictions. His presence elevated the younger actors' performances by giving them a professional standard to match and learn from during production. 5. The Soviet invasion scenario was meticulously planned. Milius and military consultants developed detailed invasion plans based on actual Pentagon war game scenarios about how Soviet forces might attack the United States through Mexico and Central America. The opening sequences showing paratroopers landing at a high school were designed to be tactically plausible, given late Cold War military capabilities and geopolitical tensions. The film incorporated real strategic concerns about NATO collapse, nuclear stalemate, and conventional invasion routes that military planners had studied throughout the 1970s and early 1980s. Critics noted that while the scenario was unlikely, it wasn't completely impossible given the military balance and international tensions of the era. The attention to strategic detail made the invasion feel more threatening than simple fantasy warfare. 6. It was filmed in New Mexico. During brutal weather, the production endured extreme conditions including intense heat, sudden storms, and difficult mountain terrain that tested cast and crew endurance throughout the demanding shooting schedule. The authentic wilderness locations created convincing partisan hideouts and combat zones, but made filming logistics extraordinarily challenging with limited access for equipment and supplies. Cast members suffered heat exhaustion, injuries from rough terrain, and genuine discomfort that translated into authentic-looking exhaustion during resistance sequences. The harsh environment meant that the physical suffering viewers saw on screen was often real rather than performed, creating raw authenticity in survival scenes. Milius deliberately chose difficult locations to ensure that everyone involved understood the genuine hardship of guerrilla warfare and wilderness survival. 7. The political controversy was immediate, and intense critics savaged Red Dawn as right-wing propaganda that glorified violence and promoted militaristic nationalism during a period of heightened Cold War tensions and nuclear anxiety. Liberal reviewers called it fascist fantasy that encouraged teenage violence and oversimplified complex geopolitical conflicts into simplistic good versus evil narratives. Conservative audiences embraced it as a patriotic statement about American self-reliance and the importance of armed resistance against tyranny and foreign occupation. The polarized reception reflected broader 1980s cultural wars about Reagan-era foreign policy, military spending, and appropriate responses to Soviet aggression. The controversy made Red Dawn more commercially successful than its quality might have warranted, with political debate driving ticket sales from curious audiences. 8. The body count was historically high. Red Dawn featured more on-screen deaths than any film previously released by a major studio, with the violence serving thematic purposes about warfare's brutal reality rather than simple entertainment. The high casualty count included both American guerrillas and Soviet soldiers, with Milius deliberately showing that resistance warfare killed people on both sides indiscriminately. The graphic violence was intended to demonstrate that fighting for freedom required genuine sacrifice, and that war wasn't the glorious adventure that patriotic rhetoric might suggest. Critics argued the violence was excessive and glorified teenage militarism, while defenders claimed it honestly depicted warfare's terrible cost. The body count controversy overshadowed the film's more nuanced themes about the psychological cost of violence and the moral compromises required for survival. 9. Patrick Swayze's performance defined his career trajectory. Swayze's portrayal of Jed Eckert as reluctant leader forced into command by circumstances showcased dramatic range beyond his dancing background and established him as credible action star. His character's emotional journey from high school athlete to hardened guerrilla commander demonstrated Swayze's ability to convey psychological transformation through subtle physical and emotional changes. The role required genuine physicality, emotional depth, and leadership presence that convinced studios he could carry action films as leading man. Swayze's commitment to the military training and his authentic portrayal of combat exhaustion impressed directors who cast him in increasingly complex roles. Red Dawn became the foundation for his transition from dancer to dramatic actor capable of handling both action and emotional material. 10. The film's ending was deliberately ambiguous. Milius refused to provide traditional Hollywood victory, instead showing that resistance came at terrible personal cost, with no guarantee of ultimate success or liberation. The surviving Wolverines' fates remained uncertain, with the film suggesting that their sacrifice might have contributed to eventual American victory, but offered no clear resolution. This ambiguous conclusion frustrated audiences expecting clear triumph, but reflected Milius's belief that real warfare rarely offered satisfying conclusions or unambiguous victories. The ending's melancholy tone contrasted sharply with the action sequences, forcing viewers to confront the reality that fighting for freedom meant losing almost everything you fought to protect. The lack of clear resolution made Red Dawn more thoughtful than typical action fare despite its controversial politics. 11. The Wolverines' name came from their high school mascot. The resistance group adopted their school sports team identity as rallying symbol, transforming teenage athletic rivalry into deadly serious partisan warfare unit designation. This choice reflected how American communities might organize resistance around existing social structures and familiar symbols that provided coherence and identity. The use of high school mascot highlighted the fighters' youth and the tragedy of teenagers forced into combat roles they should never have experienced. The Wolverines. Identity became the film's most memorable element, spawning merchandise and cultural references that outlasted the movie's theatrical run. The simple naming choice demonstrated how resistance movements create identity from whatever cultural touchstones they have available in desperate circumstances. 12. Ben Johnson's cameo. Added gravitas Johnson, legendary character actor from classic westerns, played Mr. Mason in a brief but powerful scene that connected Red Dawn to American frontier resistance traditions. His presence invokes cinematic history of American self-reliance and resistance against overwhelming odds that westerns had explored for decades. The casting suggested continuity between frontier settlers defending homesteads and modern teenagers resisting foreign occupation as part of American cultural identity. Johnson's weathered authenticity provided emotional weight to scenes about older generations, passing responsibility to youth unprepared for the burden they inherited. His cameo was Milius's way of connecting 1980s Cold War paranoia to longer traditions of American resistance narratives in cinema. 13. The Soviet characters were surprisingly humanized. Despite the film's anti-communist stance, Milius gave Soviet soldiers moments of doubt, compassion, and humanity that complicated simple villain stereotypes often found in Cold War cinema. Cuban Colonel Bella, played by Ron O'Neal, showed professional respect for the Wolverines' fighting skills, even while hunting them relentlessly through the mountains. Some Soviet characters expressed weariness with the occupation and recognition that they were perpetrating the same imperialism they claimed to oppose. These humanizing moments created moral complexity that elevated Red Dawn beyond simple propaganda by acknowledging that individual soldiers weren't monsters, regardless of their national allegiance. The nuance was often overlooked by critics focused on the film's broader political implications. 14. It influenced modern insurgency cinema. Red Dawn established templates for depicting civilian resistance that influenced later films about insurgency, occupation, and guerrilla warfare in various global contexts and conflicts. The film's realistic approach to partisan tactics and the psychological cost of resistance informed how subsequent productions portrayed irregular warfare and civilian combatants. Military training programs reportedly used Red Dawn to illustrate guerrilla warfare principles and the challenges of counterinsurgency operations against determined local resistance. The movie demonstrated how mainstream cinema could explore complex military topics beyond conventional warfare, opening space for more sophisticated treatments of asymmetric conflicts. Its influence extended beyond entertainment into serious discussions about resistance, occupation, and the ethics of civilian involvement in warfare. 15. The 2012 remake changed the invaders. The remake substituted North Korea for the Soviet Union due to changing geopolitical realities and concern about offending China, which was originally the invading force. This change was made in post-production through extensive digital editing that replaced Chinese symbols and flags with North Korean imagery throughout the completed film. The modification sparked controversy about Hollywood's self-censorship for access to Chinese markets and whether artistic vision should be compromised for commercial considerations. The original Red Dawn Soviet invasion scenario felt plausible in 1984, but was historically impossible by 2012, requiring Remake to find new antagonists for contemporary audiences. The comparison between versions highlighted how Cold War anxieties had been replaced by different fears about emerging powers and shifting global dynamics. Red Dawn remains one of cinema's most controversial action films, a movie that asked whether teenage resistance could stop superpower invasion and whether patriotism justified transforming children into soldiers. Milius created a film that was simultaneously thrilling entertainment and deeply uncomfortable meditation on warfare's cost and the loss of innocence it requires. 40 years later, its imagery of American occupation still provokes debate about nationalism, resistance, and the price of freedom. Drop a comment below. What legendary film should we dive into next? Because in a world full of invasions, some resistance stories refuse to surrender.